Good morning. Good morning. We've been doing a series called Tell All Your Friends. We just want to kind of equip you as people who know Jesus, or maybe you're even just exploring Jesus, to kind of think, how would I talk about Jesus with people who don't know him? And so today we're going to talk about the topic of suffering. And if you have interacted with people in any kind of context where you've tried to tell them about Jesus, you'll know the thing that comes up over and over again is the question of, well, how can there be a loving God if there's so much suffering in the world? And sometimes that's a genuine kind of question that somebody's like, how can there be? I'm in suffering here. And at other times, it's a bit like a child in maths who sort of looks at a sum and says, oh, it's too hard, so I'm not going to bother. And so what I want to try and do today is hopefully give us a few ideas of if we genuinely want to look into this question, how do we think about it? And I want to tell you that of the 66 books in the Bible, 66 of them answer this question. Every single book of the Bible addresses this issue, and so I just want to do it. Now, what I want to suggest also is that I don't think you get many answers to this question in many places, and yet many of us suffer significantly. So this is a very real question that we struggle with getting an answer to, and I just want to sort of put that right up front. You know, if you're here, you might be well experiencing huge suffering at the moment, and so we want to try and provide both kind of some ideas, but also hopefully a sense of actually how God himself will meet with you. What we don't want to do is give any simplistic answers. So I'm just going to draw a line here on this board. Hopefully you can see it. Okay, so if this line represents all the suffering that you go through in your life, this line represents all the suffering that you will go through in your life. Generally, people will be like, oh, this is awful. But the Bible kind of will pull out, actually, there's three specific things that cause suffering in your life. There's three specific things. So it talks quite a lot about how actually there can be self-inflicted, sorry for my writing, self-inflicted suffering. There's a portion of the suffering that you experience which is self-inflicted. You make stupid decisions, and those decisions come back and cause you trouble. Self-inflicted suffering. You know, for example, I when we were first married, I used to think it was a great thing to try and wind up my wife, especially just before we went to bed. And so I try and think of new ways to kind of tease her, because I had brothers and I thought this is what you should do. And so I'd like hide things under her pillow, so as she went to lie down she'd be like, ah! You know, like a spider or something that she doesn't like. Or I deliberately, as she was trying to fall asleep, just as she was falling asleep, I'd go, Leslie, like really loud, and wake her up, she'd be, ah! And actually I brought upon myself some self-inflicted suffering, because I really got to the point where Leslie would be like, do you know, I just can't trust you anymore. Like, honestly, I'm always on edge when I'm around you. I feel like you're going to do something stupid to me. And it actually affected our marriage. It's like the first year of our marriage, I'd be like, she can't trust me. She can't trust me. It's like, of course she can't trust you, because you've spent a lot of time trying to make her, like, be scared. It's self-inflicted suffering. And you'll know many people, you know, they overindulge on alcohol or on drugs or all kinds of things. There's an aspect which is self-inflicted. But then there's a significant aspect which is caused by others. And the Bible will kind of over and over again point out that so much of the trouble that you have, so much of the suffering that you go through has been brought into your life by other people. So you know, look, we won't have to go and do a survey, but you can just think, you know, maybe your parents treated you badly, maybe you live in a community where people abuse or mistreat or promote lying, or maybe you live in an environment where your access to education is really poor. maybe you live in an environment where you suffer racism. Maybe you live in an environment where people constantly are kind of encouraging you to do things which are just deeply unhelpful. And so others betray you and accuse you and hurt you and cause harm to you. And this is another genuine source of suffering that you'll find. And then there's a final aspect of suffering, which the Bible is very clear about right from the beginning, which is that there's a sense that there's decay is built into our creation. There's decay in our creation. And so, for example, a body can be super healthy, and then it just begins to decay and catches some kind of illness. There's a decay within creation in the way that the continental shelf kind of it comes against one another, causes an earthquake, causes a volcano, causes tsunamis, and there's a decay built into creation. And so when we look at any kind of issue of suffering, the question is, what is the kind of suffering that is really troubling us? What is the kind of suffering? We say, how can there be a loving God when suffering's in the world? Or which kind of suffering is it that we think a God could not allow? And so it's just we're trying to build in a little bit more of an understanding. You see, for example, if you just look at knife crime, the question of knife crime, which is so massive in our particular area, in Purley just this last week, 3 people stabbed, 1 killed. And it's so natural just in society, we'll just say knife crime, well, it's just gangs. It's just gangs. And it's such a simplistic understanding of where the source of suffering is. But with this greed, you can say, well, some of it is just, who knows? Let's look at it. Let's work it through. Like, is there something here which people have mistreated these guys? Mistreated one another, and all they've ever learned is anger and lying and betrayal, and so therefore they act out of that. Is it they're also making some stupid decisions themselves? Is it that actually there's a sense of just the decay in creation, just that life isn't as it should be? All of these things we can begin to see. And what the Bible does is it specifically addresses these things. So in the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs deliberately addresses this aspect of life. The book of Proverbs. Are you somebody who always seems like bad things happen to you? Proverbs would say, well, maybe it's because you're doing stupid stuff. Seriously, maybe you're just making stupid decisions. So just stop making stupid decisions. And the thing about the Bible is I'm going to teach you how to do this. I'm going to teach you. So it teaches you basic things like don't lie, don't just follow whatever whim, take lots of advice, be careful with your money. There's loads of things about Proverbs that accesses this. But then in wisdom literature in the Old Testament, also what you find is that Ecclesiastes is like, well, hold on a minute. There's quite a lot of people, and all they do is good. They make wise decisions all the time, and yet bad things is still happening to them. And so you have the book of Ecclesiastes, and that kind of addresses this question here. And Ecclesiastes is a slightly grumpy kind of conclusion, like it's slightly depressed, like you can even do really good stuff all the time, and still your life doesn't go well. You can trust God, you can do what he says, and still, what's the point? Have you read Ecclesiastes? It's a great book. So it brings the wisdom of God to say, actually, life isn't just if you do good things will happen to you. Also, just sometimes you do good and bad things happen, and you do bad and good things happen. And it kind of addresses this topic here. And then the book of Job absolutely addresses this point here. A man who is perfect and holy in every way, and yet he suffers tremendously through no fault of his own. And so actually when you look at the question of suffering, God has answered 3 different ways the question of suffering in his book, in the Old Testament. And so this question of why is there suffering is the question that God demands you ask him over and over again. He demands that you ask him, why is there suffering? It's not like kind of a surprise to God that people would want to have this question. In fact, it's the demand of God that you would ask him, why is there suffering? And so you kind of look at it like that, and actually you find in the book of Job, there's a little bit of like, in the end he reconciles himself. Yes, I did no wrong, and I suffered hugely, and yet somehow God has been my portion, and he has made it worthwhile. You kind of land on Job, and it's like, this doesn't answer why those things happen, but it's like, yeah, God has been the solution to my suffering, even though it was no fault of my own, it was just a part of the decay and the mistreatment by others. And that in the Old Testament is where you land really on the question of suffering. And yet in the New Testament, Jesus comes and he brings a new answer, which is a greater answer to suffering. And so what he does is Jesus comes and he places himself directly in suffering. He suffers at the hands of others, totally and utterly on the cross. So God no longer just is happy to watch from afar and say, ask me the question about suffering. He now comes specifically into suffering and experiences it with us as his people. And from the cross, he releases three things as his solution to these kind of three different aspects of suffering. And it's quite important we get these things right. What he does to those of us who've self-inflicted suffering, we've brought suffering upon ourselves, is he offers freedom. You've built stupidity into your life, you've acted in loads of dumb ways, you've constantly spent the money as soon as it's come into your pocket, you've constantly mistreated people, abused people, you've constantly been lazy, you've not worked hard, you've not got a job, you've not been bothered to do most normal things in life. And Jesus is like, I'm going to give you freedom from this pattern of behavior that you've built. I'm going to forgive you, and I'm going to give you freedom. By my Spirit, I can change you. I'll set you free from this self-inflicted suffering you're bringing. And then what he brings into the suffering that's from others is comfort. He brings comfort. You've suffered from others, he brings his comfort that you can forgive them. You can say, actually, even though these people have mistreated me, my God is my portion. He has comforted me. A sense of comfort he brings. Through the cross, comfort is released. If you're suffering right now because somebody's been really out of line to you, comfort can be released into your life because of the cross. So that's a genuine reality. And then the third thing that he releases is actually through the cross and then through the resurrection. I wish I could write it neater. Hope. He releases hope that one day this decay which is currently experienced all through creation, there is a hope released in the cross and resurrection that actually one day he will come and remove this decay and all things will be made right. All things will be made right. And then what Jesus does, and you need to get this right, because if you've, in certain church circles, they don't get this right. And I don't want to ever criticize what other Christians say, but I just want to get this right. What he does here is he releases hope. He does not at this point release total healing of the decay in creation. So you've got to get this right. He releases hope, which you can experience the first fruits of right now. We can pray for healing and see healing, but ultimately what the cross releases is a hope that in the future, the full healing will come. So in certain Pentecostal circles, you'll be taught that if you believe and have enough faith, you will see all healing. And you won't. Because decay still exists within our creation until the day that Jesus returns and he releases all of the health and all of the goodness and all things are made new. So you won't always receive the fullness of healing right now. You'll go through sickness and sometimes horrible death, sometimes easy death, sometimes all kinds of... And there's first fruits of this hope that you can taste right now. Are you with me? So the question of suffering is something that actually every book, every one of the 66 books addresses. It always talks about suffering. This isn't a surprise to God. It's something he actively encourages you to ask. Now, what I want to do is flesh this out, because this is theory. And I doubt if a friend at work said, how can there be a God if there's suffering in the world? Just say, let me get my whiteboard, and you draw all of it out. I mean, I'm trying to equip you with a bit of background understanding. But what we want to do is just actually ask some of our friends up to kind of give stories of how they've experienced this. So first of all, we're going to have Dorothy come. Give Dorothy a round of applause. So Dorothy's just going to address this question of comfort. How does Jesus, by his cross, bring comfort into your life? So Dorothy, just give us just 10-second, who are you first of all?
Hi, my name's Dorothy Tamuno. I'm married to Precious, some might know.
And where do you live, and what's a week look like for you?
I live 2 minutes away from here, but I'm usually still late, so that doesn't help. That wasn't the question, but I just thought I'd add that in.
Okay. Right, so tell us about comfort that's been released to you by Jesus. Tell us that.
Yeah. So I shared a dream with Tom about 2 weeks ago, but just to give you some background context. From about 0 to about age 10, I can remember there being a lot of violence in my home between my mum and my dad. And, it's not even a thing where they would, fight, like, away from us. It would be, like, we're all in the living room. It would happen, different situations. And my earliest memories are quite painful, supposed to, like, happy, and I don't really remember seeing peace or love between my mother and my father. And sometimes in my adult life, I'll have flashes of remembering those times, like being there, present while those things are happening before my eyes. And sometimes I can feel like deep sorrow, and I would pray, like, God, please give me the peace that I need and comfort me in those areas. But you'll pray it, but you don't really think. Well, I guess, yeah, you believe that Jesus has done it. So I didn't really think that it affected me, like, in my adult life or whatever. So fast forward, I'm now age 29. About 2 weeks ago, I had a dream that, again, going back to my earliest memory, we used to live in New Addington, just down the road. And I think I was maybe about, like 1.5, 2, I don't know. But I remember myself trying to walk. And I remember I was trying to walk down our hallway, and I was like trying to find my feet, and I'll fall and I'll get back up again. And then in my dream, I saw like Jesus like stretch out his hand and was trying to help me to walk. So now I was like waddling. And then that was like the first part of the dream. And in the second part of the dream, I was in that moment again where my parents were fighting. And so I'm saying it's a dream, but this actually happened in real life. So in the dream, I actually saw that Jesus was there in that scene. And I was crying, like, hysterically. I remember screaming, "Dad, get off Mum, get off Mum." And Jesus was looking as well, and Jesus was crying as much as I was crying. And I was looking at Jesus' face, like, I've pictured this moment so many times, but I've never seen Jesus in the room until that dream. So there was a part where my parents were fighting, and my dad was like over my mum, and Jesus put his hand on them, and then they stopped, and then that actually happened in reality. Then I said to Jesus, "Can you do something? Like, don't allow them to continue fighting." And then Jesus left the room, so I was like, okay, that's not what you meant to do, but okay. So Jesus walked out of the room, but then in the dream, the police came, and again, that happened in reality. When I woke up, for the first time, I felt like I felt like comfort that, most times I remember this being alone and being afraid and being scared, but for the first time, I felt like, wow, like Jesus was actually there in those moments. And like I mentioned, those are like my earliest memories when I was like 3, 4, 5, 6, going up to 10. But I gave my life to Christ around age 10. So it also said to me that, Jesus was actually there. Like, he was watching over me. He was with me, holding me up, as even like the word says. So yeah, that brought a lot of comfort.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a horrible, horrible thing that the kids have to be kind of in the room when this kind of violence is going on. And so it might be that even some of you you're like, that's what I've experienced, that's something that I've seen and I've known. And I just want you to pull out here that what Jesus doesn't do, he doesn't come in and prevent it happening up front every time. I wish that was the case, but it doesn't. But he brings his comfort after the event into Dorothy, and he can do that with you as well, to bring a sense of comfort that he's there, he's present with you. And that's just an example of actually the kind of comfort that Jesus brings. The kind of comfort that Jesus brings. So Dorothy, thank you so much for sharing, because it's vulnerable and personal things you're sharing, but it's so helpful for us just to see like genuine examples of the comfort of Jesus coming to meet with us. So next I'm going to invite Leon up. Okay, so we know Leon, don't we? Do we know Leon? And I like Leon. I like Dorothy as well.
I like you too as well.
Yeah. So Leon has done a lot of work with guys where there's genuine suffering in their life. And it's not like you could just click a finger and everything's sorted out. Like, it's not that. You've done a lot of work with, just tell us over the years what you've done. Just.
Yes, so over the last, say, 10, 15 years, I've been working with young people from Croydon area who've gone through trauma, whether it's stabbings, domestic violence, neglect, bereavement. The list goes on really. A lot of that involves a lot of pain, and from that, they'll find different ways to escape. So they might, in terms of self-inflicting, they might, there's substance misuse issues, so alcohol, drugs, self-harm. Those are the sort of young people I've worked with from Croydon.
So give us a bit of a flavour, Leon. When we are engaging with people, and it's not just like a simple, whose is very few people's suffering is like a simple click of the finger. How do we talk about this stuff, God being the solution to comfort, in a way that's helpful?
Yeah, for me personally, in terms of before I talk about Jesus, for me it's about relationship. The Bible says in Romans 12, weep with those who weep, or mourn with those who mourn. And it's not something I hear really spoken about in church. Mourn, I want you to mourn, I want you to weep. But the Bible encourages us to weep with those who weep, and to rejoice with those who rejoice. So for me, that involves care, that involves love, that involves crying, that involves literally, like, Tom, you're going through stress, I'm going to share that with you, and I'm going to weep with you, I'm going to go through it with you. That is what God encourages us to do, and that's something that I've had to do before I start sharing anything else. I've had to literally get alongside people, and this is not a thing where I'm talking about non-Christians exclusively. This is whether you're non-Christian or you're Christian. It's the same thing. Literally, if my brother in Christ is weeping, God encourages me to weep with them, to get alongside them. And if you're not a Christian, just the same. It's not like you're better. Literally the same way you do with your brother, with the people in our community, in our society, the people that we live with, the same way God encourages us to get alongside them. And when you asked me to talk, I went into the scriptures and I see that this is what Jesus done. This is not something that Jesus just asked us. He literally he does this, and he's done it before. For example, the story of Lazarus, where Lazarus died, and people were weeping, and the Bible says that he was troubled. His spirit was moved, and he was troubled, and he wept. Jesus cried. Before any healing took place, he cried. He wept with the people, and then we see that it didn't just stay there, because one thing that I've seen is that sometimes when you're weeping and you get alongside them, you become the superhero, you become the main person. But what we see with Jesus is that it always pointed towards God. So for me, it's not enough just to weep. It has to be a weeping. I get alongside you and I'm pointing you towards something greater. And as we see, Jesus healed people. And that's what I practice in terms of what Jesus has done. But in terms of for myself personally, I believe everyone in this room has gone through suffering. I've gone through suffering. And if I think about the 3 most painful things that I've gone through, and maybe all of you could maybe think about the 3 most painful things you've gone through. For me personally, there's one of the main things was my friend getting murdered, and I've seen the comfort of God in that area where that I don't have that pain anymore. I can talk about it, and I've forgiven the people, and I've seen God miraculously do a work in my life in that area. But there's the 2 other ones that are most painful. There's things I'm still working through, like betrayal with like my close friends. Like 2 of my close friends betraying me in different ways, and I've had to seek God. I've had to weep to God. I've had to go to God to continually receive that comfort, continually receive that healing. And sometimes what I found is sometimes we find it hard to weep with people and to lead people to Christ because us in ourselves, we find it hard to cry out to God. We need to go to God first to ask God to help us to bring our issues, because sometimes our issues are stopping us from helping other people who have issues. And for me, in my walk, in my journey, I've had to keep going to God with certain issues and ask God to heal me. And I've seen God heal me and help me to trust people, help me to hold on to that hope that's in Christ. And through that's allowed me to weep with people, to lead people to Christ. I'll give you an example. Just like recently this week, there's some issues at work. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but a lot of my colleagues have been anxious about it, and I've had to come alongside them. And we had a meeting, and I said to them, I was open about it. I said, God has spoken to me and told me how to approach this meeting.
You said that in the meeting?
No, I said that to them.
Before the meeting?
Before the meeting. I said it to all my colleagues. I said, God has told me how to approach this meeting. And then we went to the meeting, and I approached it how I approached it. And they was like, wow, they was like, wow, because I can't really go into too much, but basically I've been away for whatever reasons, and they was.
Did you rap in the meeting?
No, I should have, innit? I should have just anyway, yeah, we're moving away. But yeah, anyway, things happened before I got involved. I got involved, and they saw God at work. So I got alongside them. I brought God to the table, and God showed up to the point where we had to do something afterwards, and they was like, Leon, when we do this, like, can you pray? They asked me to pray in this situation. So we did whatever we did, and they asked me to pray, and I said, do you want me to pray? I said yes. I said, okay, cool. So I prayed, and for me, it's like, if I didn't get alongside them, if I didn't care, but if I didn't weep with them, they might have not, I wouldn't have been a credible person. So for me, I've seen it like part in part. It's a few layers. So basically what I'm saying is that we should weep with those who weep. We should lead people to Jesus openly, just like we would in ministry time at church. But also, an important part of it is us also crying out to God ourselves. And that relationship that we have with God should be so contagious that it just has a ripple effect on the people that we talk with. And that's what I've personally seen in my life, and I've seen God heal me in so many different ways, and He's continually healing me. So yeah, I think that's what I can share on this topic.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much. And if you want Bible for that, then 2 Corinthians chapter 1 is just amazing. With the comfort we receive from God, then we use that to comfort others. And that is what Leon is doing. He's saying, that's it. That's the whole thing. With the comfort we receive, we then pass on to comfort others. We also want to, though, be real. And again, I just want to stress, like, the shocking reality of this, that God deliberately brings to our attention over and over again that it's almost like there's something wrong with what He's made. Like, He deliberately pushes that in our face, like, don't you see there's a decay in creation? Like, He never hides that. And so what we want to do is just, if Liz, my friend, just wants to come up, we just want to think, well, hold on a minute. Like, God wants us to acknowledge that there's a decay in creation. Like, there's sickness, there's death, there's all these kind of issues that are going on. Like, how do we bring God as a solution to these things, even if we're not just seeing like a snap of the finger, this person's healed? Like, we've seen people we love die, even in this church, we've seen that happen. So how do we bring God into this? Liz, give us.
Thanks.
Just tell us a little bit about who you are first, Liz.
Oh, that's bright. My name's Liz, and I was psychiatric nurse all my working life, and now I'm retired. How's that?
Very good.
Okay. So what we're talking about, bringing God's...
Yeah, we want to show that God is the solution to people's suffering.
Okay.
We know he is. So just give us, if we actually want to then really help somebody receive that help from God, how do we do it?
Talking about receiving that, I think from personal experience, having received prayer from other people, I can tell you what it's like when other people are, as Leon says, listening to God and have that relationship with God. Then so years ago, I was living in Belfast, and if you're from Belfast, sorry, I was really very unhappy, and I felt that God couldn't see me. I felt I was hidden from God. God could see my husband, he couldn't see me. And I felt absolutely cut off and totally abandoned, and it was a very, very dark place. And somebody who hardly knew me listened to God, and she came and knocked on my door and said, she brought me flowers, so that was showing God's kindness and God's love. And she said, I have 2 verses. One, I think God's asking me to tell you, but it seems a bit weird, and I thought this other one might be helpful. But the verse she brought from God was from Psalm 31, verses 21 and 22. And it was, when I was in a besieged city and cut off from your sight, you heard my cry for mercy and came for help. And it was the exact words that I have been saying to God, and I didn't realize. And the profound effect of that was that God had seen me and heard me. And she was obedient to God. She was listening to God. And I think even more recently, I have been prayed for, and the person praying for me has listened respectfully, kindly, as I said my stuff, and I can't tell you now, it's too many people know. But as I said my stuff, I was listened to respectfully and kindly. And as I was talking and crying, she was praying, and I knew that she was listening to God. And she was able to, without judgment, without criticism, minister Jesus' love to me and pray for me. And as I repented, she was able to minister and say, yeah, God forgives you. And I think for that was a whole powerful thing, and we can do that. Each one of us can do that as we come and pray for people here at any time in our lives. We can bring that goodness, that non-judgment, that respect, that kindness, listening to people, not crowding people, giving them space, giving them. And if people say, "I don't want to be prayed for," don't pray for them. And if people have received what God is saying, just bless them. But there is love, there is respect. Ask people if you can put your hand on them. I know that someone recently had said, I want prayer for my really painful shoulder, and the person praying for them immediately slapped a hand on it to pray for them, and how that's so inappropriate. So we just need to be careful, and God wants to bring healing and a sense of his peace and presence. And maybe the circumstances don't change, but what changes is what's inside you.
Yeah, so you are a carrier of hope. If you know Jesus, you are a carrier of hope. And as you go in, we really encourage you in this church to really step into the kind of activity of, exactly as Liz is saying, like that kind of gentle, loving kind of interaction where we're leading somebody into the receiving from Jesus. So we call it ministry. And again, you may be from places where that's kind of often like really full on, and like a pastor like will lay a hand and everyone's flying all over the place. And there's a place for that. We don't say there's no place for that. But what we love is actually to minister hope in a situation where it's not like, oh, suddenly everything's going to be fixed. It's that gentle, sensitive, listening to the Lord, passing on a verse, but ministering hope. God sees you, and I minister to you right now the hope that one day God will make this good. He will make this good. And that's what we want to really encourage you. You can do that to any person. If you get to the stage in a relationship with them where you can just lay a hand on them and say, can I just pray for you? And if they don't want you to lay a hand on, or you can just say, can I just pray for you? And you can just minister hope. We just minister hope that Jesus sees it, And he can make it, and he will make it good in the end. Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you. So we've talked a lot about how we bring God as solution to suffering of people in their individual moment. I just want to bring up one final little thing, which is another thing that people might ask, well, why does God even allow any of this to happen in the first place? Like, why is it, if God is really loving and he's all powerful, how can he allow suffering? And that's kind of, it's sort of called the contradiction. And that's, again, I just want to tell you, there is a context in our world, in fact, where we do have an understanding of suffering in which we regard it as being actually a helpful thing. We do regard it as being a helpful thing. And so if we have a God who is all loving and all powerful, this is Ravi Zacharias, who's so good on these things. He says, well, why stop there? Because God isn't just all loving and all powerful. God is also all knowing. God is also all knowing. So he probably knows some things that we don't know. And also God is eternal. God is eternal. So I'm just going to give you a little example of a context in which we understand suffering as actually being something that in the long term can bring good. So I'm hoping Paul's going to help me out here. Anybody go to Zumba? Anybody go to Zumba? Anybody know anybody goes to Zumba? What do you do in Zumba? You embrace suffering in the moment. You embrace suffering in the moment. For what purpose? That it will lead you after the suffering to a place of greater health. That's what we do. And oh dear, stage is falling apart. Hold on. There's a bit more of another move. So you embrace, thank you very much, Paul. There is a context in our world in which we actually do see that there's a moment in which suffering can produce within us a strength that goes beyond what we would have without it. So when you go to the gym, do you know this? So actually every time you go, you damage your muscles, and your muscles grow because you've damaged them, and then when they're repaired, they grow bigger. And every aspect of what we do in physical training is an embracing of suffering in a moment for a greater good. I love all sport, as you know, and so is Tour de France at the moment. And what they'll say in the Tour de France afterwards, they're like, oh yeah, I love suffering. Like, I've learned that if I suffer more than anybody else, I will beat them in the race. And so Geraint Thomas, who's a Welsh guy, number one cyclist in the world at the moment, he's like, the reason I'm the best is because I put myself through more suffering and I can go deeper into pain than anybody else. Now listen, nobody would want that to be the case, I don't think, that you have to suffer, but there's a reality that you see that suffering can yield good after the event. So the fact that God is eternal can mean that for a period of time, an element of suffering can be something that we go through for a greater good that comes the other side of it. And that's why in the book of James it says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you go through any kind of trial, because in it will lead you towards a greater level of intimacy with the Lord and strength with the Lord. And it says in Romans 5, right, suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, hope, and hope does not disappoint us. And so what we end up is that God is not just all loving and not just all powerful, but he's also all knowing. He sees things and knows things that go beyond what we have, and he's also eternal. So in the end, at this moment, this pain is horrendous. And yet, in the end, the sense that he will bring to us something that takes us beyond what we would have had without it. Now that's the New Testament kind of, that's what it says. And so often what it brings us is intimacy with the Lord. That's where Job ends, strangely enough. That's where Job ends. He ends with intimacy with the Lord. And if we are people, just trying to bring us into this, that if we are people who at the moment are in suffering, the Lord wants to bring comfort to us. He wants to bring hope to us that at one day it will end. But also we know that in the midst of this, he can change us and draw us closer to himself. And then in the end, one day, all suffering will be done. Jesus will live as us, and all things will be made right forever and ever. Should we pray?